Trained and ready, South Vietnamese Air Force F-5 set out on a strike mission. Designed to meet rigid specifications, these planes were small, lightweight, and inexpensive. As the first weapon system developed by the United States government to meet the conditions of the Military Assistance Program, these planes were developed for America's smaller allies. Eventually, over 20 countries employed them. The Northrop F-5 Freedom Fighter. The F-5 defied trends in fighter aircraft of the day. Military needs were drastically reappraised following the Korean War, and most manufacturers were producing bigger and more complex aircraft. New avionics, missiles, and engines necessitated growth in the size of fighter aircraft. But the Northrop Company went its own way. Northrop's design team researched the pros and cons of this trend and arrived at its own set of general requirements. As they saw it, the most important of these was the need to keep the planes small. In a classic case of successful innovation, Northrop's reappraisal not only led to the F-5, but eventually had a much wider effect on the development of future fighter aircraft. The role the plane was built to fill was a humble one. There was nothing humble about Northrop's little masterpiece. It emerged as a very maneuverable and deadly weapon. The F-5C was a rare type. 19 F-5s were re-equipped for U.S. Air Force combat trials in Vietnam. Because of these modifications, they were given the separate designation F-5C. To pilots, they were better known as the Scotia Tigers. With combat trials completed, the modified planes were handed over to the VNAF and became South Vietnam's first modern jet fighters. In the skies over Vietnam, the Freedom Fighter proved its worth in battle and underlined how much it could add to the operational capacity of a small nation's Air Force. Orders soon flowed into Northrop, and F-5s spread around the globe. In action, the Vietnamese pilot's aggressiveness combined well with the little plane's accuracy, particularly during ground attack. The plane's load was small, but the precision of its delivery made up for the lack of bulk. The F-5's success in Vietnam confirmed the value of Northrop's developmental work. The design team's dedication resulted in a plane that was simple and easy to maintain. Its reliability gave it an edge over other similar types. F-5s established the highest operational readiness figures with the lowest maintenance man-hours. The plane's ease of control, stability, maneuverability, and accuracy endeared it to its pilots. Unfortunately, its extraordinary agility in a dogfight was not fully appreciated until 10 years after Vietnam. The F-5's evolution goes back to 1955, when Northrop completed the first phase of its fighter research studies. They produced Design N156 to serve as the basis for the development of either a supersonic trainer or a lightweight fighter. Although the Air Force wasn't interested in a small fighter at the time, the design's merit as a trainer was undeniable. And on June 15, 1956, the green light was given for the production of prototypes of what became known as the T-38 Talon. On April 10, 1959, the first T-38 took to the air in a series of tests that were remarkably smooth. It was the first supersonic plane to go through testing without a major accident. No aerodynamic changes were called for, and the plane performed flawlessly. The T-38 came out with an instantly established reputation for outstanding flight handling and forgiving characteristics. Following the success of the initial flights, large orders poured in. By October 1959, production was stepped up from 2 planes a month to 10. Eventually, nearly 1,200 T-38 Talons were built. Meanwhile, the company continued to develop the fighter version at its own expense, tailoring it to the emerging market with America's less affluent allies. This may have been a gamble, but it was a well-informed one. U.S. defense officials could see many advantages in providing friendly nations with advanced equipment. Additionally, it made sense to equip them with combat-capable modern weapons rather than antiquated ones. Many saw allies with obsolete equipment as liabilities to America's foreign policy goals. In May 1958, Northrop was instructed to go ahead with construction of 3 prototype N-156 fighters. Already in place, T-38 tooling served to accelerate production efforts, and the first N-156 fighter took to flight only 14 months later. Despite successful testing, the U.S. Air Force still had no interest in a small fighter, and foreign reception of the aircraft was lukewarm at best. Only 2 of the prototypes were completed. The third, partially constructed prototype was stored away, but not forgotten. For a time, the U.S. Army became very interested in the N-156F as a ground attack and close support fighter. In competition with other planes, the N-156F demonstrated outstanding capabilities. Many were impressed with its reliability and ease of maintenance. But the Army competition was soon called off, mainly because of inter-service rivalries. Operating high-performance land-based fighters was a realm closely guarded by the U.S. Air Force. The Freedom Fighter was caught in a bureaucratic quagmire, for although the Air Force had no real interest in the plane, it was unwilling to operate them for the Army, nor was it about to let the Army operate the fighter on its own. The N-156F project languished. Northrop was very confident that they had a great plane, and everybody who came into contact with it was equally impressed. Nevertheless, there were no buyers. In May 1962, almost 3 years after the first flight, a breakthrough occurred when the Department of Defense reviewed the needs of America's NATO and SEATO allies. Existing practice was to supply the poorest of these allies with aging U.S. jets, no longer wanted by the Pentagon. Some saw this as an ineffective use of resources. What was really needed was the modern, inexpensive plane sitting dormant in Northrop's factory. The Kennedy administration had vowed to pay any price for the maintenance of freedom. That bill included modernizing and re-equipping Allied military forces. And as far as a lightweight, low-cost fighter was concerned, there was no need to look further than the N-156. It was soon announced that the plane would be supplied to favored nations under the Military Assistance Program, also known as MAP. The program was formally launched in October 1962. Orders were placed for 2 versions of the N-156F, a single-seat fighter and a 2-seat version to double as a trainer. These were given the U.S. Air Force designations F-5A and F-5B. The partially built third prototype was still in storage, but this too was dusted off, fitted with several new specifications, and designated the YF-5A. The first flight of the new plane took place on July 31st, 1963. Northrop test pilot Hank Chouteau took the controls for what proved to be an incident-free flight. As with the T-38 and N-156 trials, the testing program went off without a hitch. Changes from the earlier designs had been few. These principally in more powerful engines and increased weapons loads. The plane was also given a more rugged landing gear for use from rough terrain. Despite an increased load and heavier engines, the F-5 was still tiny compared with other fighters of the day. Only about a third the weight of an F-4 Phantom. Its compactness was attributed to the power plants chosen for the plane. Northrop designers had been quick to note the development of smaller turbojets designed for use in missiles. The Northrop team saw the chance to save significantly in thrust-to-weight ratios, not to mention the fact that a two-engine plane was just a whole lot safer to fly. The two engines were located side by side in the aft fuselage. True power brokers, they weighed only 570 pounds each, including afterburners, and packed 4,080 pounds of thrust. With a simple two-point mounting onto built-in overhead tracks, maintenance was so simple that a crew of 3 could remove and replace an engine in 20 minutes. Part of Northrop's concept had been the importance of simplifying maintenance, and the design incorporated many features which directly addressed this. Further, the plane had little in the way of complex avionics and electronics. The high operational readiness of the aircraft was due in no small part to the ease and simplicity of ground handling and overhaul tasks. Compared with other supersonic aircraft, the F-5 was a dream to work with. A total of 8 aircraft were used in the development and flight test program. These were quickly followed by production models. Initial deliveries were made in 1964 to Williams Air Force Base. Here, air and ground crews trained on the aircraft. These men would later instruct foreign servicemen in the plane's maintenance and operation. In time, each mapped country that received the F-5 sent groups of pilots and specialists for training. The aim was to have these people return to their homelands as qualified instructors. The F-5s used in this program all carried U.S. Air Force markings, but were in fact owned by the Allied nations. The first classes got underway in September 1964 with crews from Iran and Korea. U.S. pilots working with the Military Assistance Advisory Group also attended this course. They would later advise F-5 customers on how to best integrate new planes into service. The F-5B two-seaters also passed their tests with flying colors and were soon shipped to buyers around the world. These planes were equipped with dual controls, and the instructor pilot, seated above and behind the forward cockpit, could take over if needed. In addition to this training capability, the planes also doubled as attack aircraft. Given the impoverishment of many of the client nations, the plane was also designed to cope with rough terrain and rudimentary or non-existent landing strips. The ruggedness and stability of the little planes made them perfectly tailored to this type of operation. The Freedom Fighter wasn't terribly sophisticated. and this may have compromised some aspects of its performance. But for its customers, it was usually the best option they had. They found that it ideally matched their capabilities and budgets, while giving them a coldly efficient defensive and offensive strike weapon. For most of the nations in question, this was the first time that they had effective modern combat aircraft at their disposal. One of Northrop's major problems was that this scaled-down fighter had to accommodate a myriad of existing weapon systems. Special care was needed in the design of the small plane, since standard items such as stores pylons and ammunition belts have always been proportionately larger. The bulk of these common systems ultimately sets a minimum practical size limit for any combat aircraft. The F-5A was equipped with two nose-mounted 20mm cannon. Similar to its ground handling, the routine to clear, load, and arm the guns were simple. Everything was within reach of a crewman standing on the ground. Aiming the guns was also simple. With minimal skill levels and a few tools, this was accomplished with little difficulty. The guns themselves were rapid firing, cutting loose 1,500 rounds per minute. A short burst from the two cannons could do lethal damage. In addition, Sidewinder missiles could be mounted on the wingtips to give the little fighter a hefty air-to-air punch. From such a stable and easily controlled weapons platform, the F-5's guns had deadly accuracy. Although the two-seat B model carried no nose cannon, both versions had 7 external store stations. These accommodated a full spectrum of tactical ordnance and fuel. Up to 6,200 pounds of missiles, bombs, napalm, and rockets could be carried on all types of missions. As a tactical support weapon, the F-5 proved its worth repeatedly. The Freedom Fighter's combination of outstanding high and low-speed maneuverability, unrestricted visibility, rapid response speed, and stability made it an excellent close support and interdiction aircraft. Upon its introduction in 1964, the F-5 made a big impact. In 1964 and 1965, the plane won 85% of the weapons meets in which it was entered. These formal contests took place both in the USA and overseas, and pitted the Freedom Fighter against a variety of the West's best frontline fighters. This compact warbird had virtues that made it a real handful to contend with. The initial orders placed by the Defense Department in 1962 totaled 71 F-5As and 15 F-5Bs. Many more orders flowed into Northrop as the years passed. The first F-5s to go into service were activated by Iran in February 1965. By the end of that year, another 5 air forces had purchased the new planes. In the meantime, additional orders poured in for standard F-5s. The plane was so impressive that several non-MAT countries decided to buy it themselves. As early as 1964, agreements were reached with Norway and Spain, the latter including under license production. In 1965, Canada also decided to buy the Freedom Fighter, once again with production taking place in the customer's factory. Each year, more countries joined the list. As with many modern innovations, the F-5 had to give a good deal of credit to the space race. A design theory called area rule was applied to the plane. This concept, developed by NASA, streamlined the airflow past the fuselage and resulted in what was often called the Coke bottle shape. It was area rule that gave the F-5 its slim waist. The limitations of the F-5 were compensated for by the power and sophistication of the weapons it could employ. With sidewinders and cannon, it was a dangerous interceptor. In addition, a new role was developed for it with the production of an attachable camera pack. Combined with external fuel storage, this turned the plane into a long-range reconnaissance aircraft. In its primary tactical role, 4 big bullpup missiles, or up to 76 rockets, made it a potent ground attack weapon. All fuel storage, internal and external, could be pressure-filled in minutes from a single fuel inlet. This was one of the many ways in which the importance of simple maintenance had been recognized in the design. Over a quarter of the surface of the plane was made up of hatches and removable panels. This ease of access to the plane's equipment was enhanced by placing the components one deep in the fuselage. All of the major systems could be accessed and serviced with ease. Special testing equipment was minimal and was itself designed to be rugged, portable, and simple to operate. Compared with other aircraft capable of the same operational missions, the maintenance requirements of the F-5 were simple. This aspect of the plane's design was a total success. The F-5's war and fuel loads accounted for nearly 50% of its weight. This gave it the highest payload to weight ratio of any supersonic fighter. Due to the aircraft's superior aerodynamics, the small engines were able to push the fighter along at about Mach 1.3, and by now it was pretty clear that the airframe could endure much higher speeds. But these were speeds that the plane's small turbojets just couldn't muster. These limitations were to be a constant source of criticism for the Freedom Fighter. However, given that the engines were such a key to keeping the plane compact, this compromise was deemed worthwhile. The potential of the design in the close support role led the U.S. Air Force to test the planes under combat conditions in Vietnam. It was known as Operation Scotia Tiger, and 19 aircraft were re-equipped to U.S. Air Force standards in 1965. With aerial refueling systems, armor plating, and pylons that could be jettisoned, these modified planes were designated F-5Cs. The planes arrived in Vietnam on the 23rd of October and flew their first combat mission within hours of their arrival. During the 150-day evaluation, the Scotia Tigers flew more than 3,500 sorties with an average combat load of about 2,500 pounds. Most missions were flown with 500 or 750-pound bombs, although a variety of ordnance was used. The missions included close support, interdiction, armed reconnaissance, escort, and MiG-cap flights. The Tigers endeared themselves to their pilots and heavily impressed ground troops with their stability, accuracy, and reliability. Amazingly high readiness rates were established. By the end of the trials, maintenance time per flight was down to 6.5 hours. Northrop's expectation had been 21 hours, and this would have been a reasonably acceptable figure. The mission abort rate was an incredibly low 1.5%. Following such a performance, the U.S. Air Force had little choice but to take a second look at the Tigers. Its impressive outing strongly suggested that an advanced version could be designed, one that would overcome nagging doubts about the plane's engine power, range, and load. As a variation to the F-5A and B, newer and more powerful engines were adopted. In addition, many of the variations provided to foreign buyers were re-evaluated. The best of these were incorporated into the new design. Work began in April 1968, but was canceled in late '69 with the announcement that a new competition would take place, a competition to decide on a successor to the F-5 for the MAP program. Northrop's entry was a true ringer. Their newly developed F-5 model, forged out of recent combat experience in Vietnam. With little debate, the F-5 was announced as its own replacement. But to lessen confusion and to recognize the changes in the new design, new designations were issued. The single-seat version would be the F-5E, and the two-seater would be known as the F-5F. In the fall of 1971, it was announced that in tribute to the Skoshi Tigers, the new plane would be known as the Tiger II. Given that the word Skoshi is Japanese for small, the use of the whole title may have been even more appropriate for this fearsome little warplane. The rollout of the Tiger II took place on June 23, 1972, and the first flight followed on August 11th. Progress up to that time is pretty easy to measure. In 8 years of production, over 1,100 A and B models had been built. These flew in service for the air forces of over 20 nations. Northrop's Midget had turned into a giant sales success. The F-5E engines boasted 5,000 pounds of thrust, an increase of over 20%. But some of this additional power was offset by increases in the plane's weight. Though the new fighter was faster, experience would show that it still had not yet fully exploited the aerodynamics of the airframe. Lightly loaded and flat out, the E was capable of Mach 1.6, but was more comfortable cruising at high subsonic speeds. The Tiger airframe was basically the same as the earlier models. The fuselage was slightly wider, and there were several refinements to the plane's shape. But the original design work had been so good that little alteration was called for. The fuselage was all metal, with a stressed skin semi-monocoque structure. Some steel and titanium were used in the aft fuselage, but the plane was primarily riveted aluminum. The wings were one piece from tip to tip. This eliminated splices in the heavily loaded members. With the exception of steel ribs supporting the landing gear and wingtip storage station, construction was all aluminum. The wing skins were primarily shaped using chemical milling methods. The plane's combat sophistication took a leap forward with the addition of a fire control radar system and computer gun sight. This provided target detection, range tracking, and lead computation for the cannon, as well as range envelope calculation for the sidewinders. Also, air-to-ground delivery was enhanced with roll-stabilizing aiming references. Several changes were implemented to improve takeoff performance. These included air doors increasing airflow, and a two-position nose gear adding 3% to the angle of attack. With these modifications and the engine's added power, takeoff performance was improved by 30%. And even with these and other changes, Northrop was able to retain 3/4 of the tooling masters from earlier models. In service, 40% of the spares and 70% of the ground support equipment remained unchanged. Early F-5Es had interchangeable nose sections, enabling the installation of a reconnaissance package. In 1978, however, a specialized reconnaissance version was developed with a lengthened nose and a variety of other options. In addition to cameras, these included side and fore scanning infrared equipment and other sophisticated modern surveillance and search electronics. Loaded in pallets, the selected fit could be quickly installed for any mission. The recon version, christened the Tiger I, retained its sidewinders and a single cannon. Development was funded by the company and resulted in a highly specialized aircraft. Like many successful products, Northrop's Radical small fighter had now evolved into a family of planes. Production switched smoothly to the new model, and the first F-5Es were delivered by the end of 1973. By 1976, Northrop's sales of T-38s and F-5s had passed the 3,000 mark, with orders for Tiger IIs still pouring in. T-38 production ended in 1972, when the last of 1,189 aircraft was delivered to the U.S. Air Force. Incredibly, production of the Tiger II continued for another 17 years. The final E and F models were delivered to the Singapore Air Force in 1989. Altogether, the number of T-38s and F-5s manufactured was 3,806. Surprisingly, the T-38 Talon was the only version of the plane to see extensive service with the U.S. Air Force. 1,139 were purchased. In 1974, the 15-year-old design received the ultimate compliment. It was adopted by the Thunderbirds. Replacing the much larger F-4 Phantom, the T-38 brought its characteristic precision and maneuverability to the team. To its credit, it soon became evident that the team could operate 4 Talons for the same cost of 1 Phantom. On the other hand, the F-5E Tiger II became the most prolific model overall. With a wide range of equipment standards tailored to the economic capacity of various buyers, many sales were arranged outside of the Defense Department's Military Assistance Program. These included highly refined electronics packages on aircraft for Saudi Arabia. The Saudi planes, with inertial navigation, radar warning, chaff or flare dispensers, and Maverick missiles, were extremely able fighters. Reception of the Tiger II was mixed. Its virtues were acknowledged, but still the plane failed to rivet the attention of the U.S. Air Force. Again, the F-5 was judged to be lacking in power. This concern obscured the fact that the plane had phenomenal maneuverability and flight handling. Throughout its life, the F-5 was looked down upon by many experts because they considered it so underpowered and ineffective. It was an opinion that actually flew in the face of what the freedom fighter had actually proven itself to be in battle in Vietnam. A lot of the accepted wisdom of post-Korea air combat theory had been reversed in both Vietnam and the Middle East. Fighter designs were based on the idea of supersonic aircraft exchanging missiles at extreme range. However, this was unrealistic. In fact, even today, air combat rarely takes place at supersonic speeds or at extreme ranges. Once planes join combat and begin extreme maneuvers, speed is rapidly lost. Old-fashioned dogfighting follows, and pilots slug it out in close contact, desperately trying to gain an advantage. Under these circumstances, the F-5 can outfly almost anything in the sky. There is no other U.S. Air Force plane that has the F-5 specifications. Perhaps the nearest comparison would be with the Soviet MiG-21. Though the MiG had a powerful engine and could exceed Mach 2, this was its only real advantage over the Tiger. The MiG, though very maneuverable, has had a checkered career, although some of its variants are truly dangerous opponents. In a head-to-head showdown, the planes would be very evenly matched. The greater sophistication of the Tiger's avionics and the reliability of its weapon systems would have probably served to even things up. Sales of the F-5E bolstered the capability of many smaller air forces. Arrangements were made for overseas manufacture and production agreements were reached with Switzerland and Taiwan. In its role as the military assistance program's basic export model, the F-5E mirrored the success of earlier versions. The combination of low cost, high efficiency, and rugged simplicity just wasn't present in any other U.S. design. The strength of the Western alliances was immeasurably increased by this program. Throughout South America, the Middle East, and Asia, nations with small economies saw their military air power transformed virtually overnight. What was surprising were the number of planes sold to Western Europe. These purchasing decisions, like the Saudi orders, were not economically driven. Affluent countries like Norway, Switzerland, and the Netherlands simply decided that there was no advantage in buying larger, more complex, and more expensive aircraft for roles that the F-5 could easily perform. One communist air force also greatly benefited from Northrop's innovation. With the fall of South Vietnam in 1975, the North Vietnamese captured a motherlode of 87 F-5s. These planes were later used with considerable success in border clashes against their communist neighbor to the north, China. The final member of the F-5 family was the F-5G. Engines had seen dramatic improvements during the long lifespan of the F-5. More power was available from new, small, and lightweight engines. The plane was redesigned with an F-18 engine, which boasted 16,000 pounds of thrust. For the first time, the Tiger's airframe was matched with power equal to its capabilities. The result was a remarkable advance in the F-5's cat-like prowess. This was the first radical redesign of the plane and was called the F-20 Tiger Shark. With power finally of no concern, Northrop was able to pack even more systems into the plane. Though larger than its predecessors, it remained a small fighter, but its speed was now boosted to Mach 2. This was achieved without the loss of any of the F-5's legendary maneuverability and handling. The work started as a co-production effort with Taiwan, and though a presidential veto ended that partnership, Northrop continued to refine the plane up to 1980. No doubt could remain about the aircraft's performance and power. Its takeoff was outstanding, its electronics state-of-the-art, and its price still low for a high-tech aircraft. Surprisingly, despite the Tiger Shark's fearsome ability, demand for the plane simply dried up. Northrop had no choice but to accept the inevitable, and the Tiger Shark was abandoned, the last of a family of fighters extending back a quarter of a century. Over the years, the qualities of the F-5 and T-38 design have seen the little planes entrusted with some very significant roles. Because of its two seats, speed, stability, and agility, it proved to be an excellent chase plane and has played an important part in some of the United States' most significant aviation projects. When the XB-70's tires ignited on landing, the pilot heard about it first from a T-38 flying alongside. Similarly, it was a T-38 crew who noticed fluid leaking from a broken seal on the space shuttle during one of the glide trials. The role of the chase plane in a test program is an imperative one. They are not merely observers and recorders of the test plane's behavior, but are in constant contact with the test pilot. Often, they can tell him things about his aircraft that he and his instruments are unable to establish. Sometimes that information can mean the difference between a fixable problem and disaster. From the beginning, the T-38 and the F-5 have always displayed impeccable handling and stability. They always had enough aerobatic ability to please the most demanding of pilots. Even today, NASA astronauts fly T-38s in order to keep a fine edge on their piloting skills. The little trainers have also found their way into many other niches, including mission support with the Strategic Air Command. chase and test support for the Aerospace Research Pilot School, and range support at Eglin Air Force Base. But most visibly, they continue to thrill thousands with the Thunderbirds. The F-5 has also resurfaced in the X-29 program. The forward swept wing X-plane was accompanied by a T-38 chase plane during its test series. The X-29's fuselage is that of an F-5, melded to the exotic wing of this futuristic fighter. The simplicity of construction, strength, and aerodynamic soundness of the F-5 made it the perfect candidate to be part of this hybrid bird. The X-29 is an experiment that will help determine the shape of fighters of the 21st century. It's only fitting that the F-5, such a vital part of aviation history, should also be actively wedded to its future. At one time, most combat simulation exercises were conducted within wings, military aviation jargon for pitting pilots against the same type of aircraft that they were flying themselves. In wartime, this is a terribly unlikely scenario. The U.S. Navy's scheme to remedy this problem was a program called DACT, or Dissimilar Air Combat Tactics, taught at the Top Gun schools. In essence, it is training that attempts as realistically as possible to reproduce real combat conditions. When the North Vietnamese marched into Saigon, the United States found itself with an unexpected supply of F-5Es. These aircraft had been earmarked for the South Vietnamese, who would now have no use for them. It was these 70 aircraft that eventually formed the basis for the aggressor squadrons in the Air Force equivalent of Top Gun, the Red Flag exercise. Flown by some of their best pilots, the F-5 squadrons are a force to be reckoned with. The Tigers are used in part because of their similarities to the MiG-21. The Russian tactics, formations, and maneuvers used by the F-5s in Red Flag teach young pilots life-saving lessons. During these exercises, Nellis Air Force Base becomes a real combat air base, simulating the limited support facilities and organizational difficulties that would be expected in a frontline theater of war.
It's important because they find out what these planes can do in a wartime situation, and that's good practice for both the crew chiefs of the planes and the air crew.
Over the period of their use in Red Flag, the Tigers have come up against virtually every frontline fighter that the West has to offer. The aggressor pilots are very experienced, and they and their MiG-like F-5s have racked up kills against all comers. The Western power's best aircraft have been poised against them, and in 20 years the Tiger has yet to meet its master. And that stands as a sobering note, because while the Cold War and the freedom fighter are now things of the past, the MiG is still flying.
The other one's 5 miles north of him. Okay, I got the north guy. Watch for that guy to the other side there, about thanks. Roger, welcome. Okay, saying you go after the guy to the south. He's 230 for 10 coming at you. I got him. He's advancing this time. So we got some F4s north of Felicia Peak. We got the Bandits 150 for 40 miles. We may try to hit over that way. You headed south now. That's firm. We're steady about 170.
Okay, the lead just went in a right-hand turn to south. Come hard left, 180. Check on the nose a mile.
You got a bogey. 6 o'clock for 6,000 feet. Right. Keep the turn in. We're coming around hard on him. Okay, got it. Yeah. I'm going left. Somebody pick him up. Roger, he's off us. He switched. Reverse back. Come back left. He's at our 9 o'clock now. Go to that little peak. Okay, I can be in on him here, Roy. Can't get flared in. I'll stay in a right turn and get him. Hey, Fang, watch the guy now. 235 for 6 coming at you. Gonna meet him head on, Fang. Okay, I got him. Call Fox 1. Okay, Fang, the one I just shot is coming right over the port side. This time he's about 6 miles west of port side. Okay, that's where I'm at. 2-3, you got tally on 2-4. 3, let me help. Okay, the bandits are U-23, 12 o'clock for about 6,000. And we got another one at 6. Break right. Hard right. We got another bandit at right, hard right.